You're listening to the Adventure Sports Podcast. We talk with adventurers from around the globe to give you the inspiration you need to get started in the outdoors or keep moving if you're already there. Now here's your host, Kurt Linville.
Hello, Adventure Sports Podcast family. Today's episode is a revisited episode from 2021. Mason was the host, of course, and Ron Rutland is the guest, and he's talking about cycling to every country in Africa in one trip. I can't wait to listen to it, and I'm being really candid, I've not heard this one yet. So I'm excited to listen to it as I produce it here and share it with you. But I wanted to visit with you a little bit about my own Africa adventure. And of course, I'm talking about the Kilimanjaro climb that's coming up in January. We are climbing Kilimanjaro to raise money for We See Hope, which is a humanitarian organization that has been helping homeless children in Africa now for 25 years, and they have already helped 850,000 kids. So I made the announcement about this a few episodes back. The name of the episode is simply Special Announcement Kilimanjaro for We See Hope. I want to update you on the progress that we've made. So the goal here is that everyone that is on this expedition to climb Kilimanjaro is raising $20,000 for We See Hope, each person. And the goal was to have 15 climbers, so that's $300,000 for We See Hope. I made the announcement about a week ago, and we've even interviewed the founder of We See Hope, Phil Wall, and I've shared all of that with you. I'm very, very thankful for the people that have given to this effort, and I want to point out, none of the climbers are getting anything from this. If you donate to this project, then we are not getting any of that. It's not paying our way to Kilimanjaro or anything like that. Everyone is self-funded to get there and to do the expedition. All the money goes to We See Hope to help these kids in Africa. I'm just going to be as open as I can. I'm struggling a little bit with this because I don't believe in guilt trips, and I don't want this to be one. I only believe in goals and aspirations and doing great things together and loving each other, and that's what this project is about. It's about loving humanity, loving these kids who've got it tough in Africa. But I'm just going to be completely open with you. One person from the Adventure Sports Podcast family has donated thus far. There are thousands of us in the Adventure Sports Podcast family, and I don't even know how many there are. I can see how many each episode gets, how many downloads, right, each episode gets, but I know that not everyone listens to every episode, so I just know that there are several thousand of us, and one person. I am very thankful for the person who donated, and I'm not really sure what this means. I'm kind of speculating here. The question is, this is an amazing cause. It's legit. It's the real deal. It's not like someone trying to scam people out of money, showing pictures of distended tummies of little starving children in Ethiopia or something. No, I have vetted this organization and the work that they're doing, and having visited Africa, I know the need firsthand. I know it's real. I know it's legitimate. And the question I have today is, what is keeping people from becoming a part of this effort? I can only speculate, obviously, but a few thoughts that have come to mind are, we used to be a giving society in the West, and specifically in the United States. We used to be a giving society, and that was kind of tied into this idea that we were all in it together and we were supporting each other through life. And I have some years on me now, and when I was a kid, that's the way it was. People looked out for each other and gave and cared. But in my life, I have seen so many times, people taking advantage of others. There were lots of ads that showed starving children from around the world, and, the money donated mostly went to some Swiss bank account somewhere. I get it. There were lots of scams. There was a lot of fraud, and that jaded people. And then there were all the televangelists over the decades, and that's even dating me because it hasn't happened in a while, but the televangelists who just struggled and became very human and failed to be the upstanding people we would want them to be. And they were on television trying to get people to give money, give money, give money, give money. And I just think we've become jaded as a society, but something else has happened. We went kind of from a giving society to a very secular society who's very, very suspicious. And I understand that because we've seen the scams, right? So I thought, well, maybe that's it. Maybe it's just that society has changed that much. Or the other thing I thought of was, there are all these memes about starving children in Africa. And I mean, we probably grew up with that. It's like, oh, eat your food, clean your plate because there are starving children in Africa. What's crazy about that is that there are children in Africa that are seriously having a very, very rough go of it. And We See Hope is not a scam. It's the real deal. They're making a huge impact to help these kids. And I see the whole human race together as one big family. And then I started thinking, well, could it be that the listeners to the Adventure Sports Podcast just don't have the means? And then I realized I've interviewed a lot of people with the means. I know that there are people out there who have the resources to make an impact in the world. But then I started thinking about when I was in Africa and how the people in these villages would go to great extents to try to be generous with us. And I felt so guilty when I was there often because they would kill a chicken to make a special meal for us with ugali and chicken and sukuma wiki and chai and the fellowship, the people getting together and learning about each other and the laughter and the smiles, and they gave out of their extreme need. These are people that at the time were living off of a few cents a day, literally a few cents a day. And by killing a chicken, they were killing the source of the eggs that they might have to live off of. And they did this because they believed in being generous with people that they met along the way. And I always thought, wow, their generosity, giving out of their need, that was the culture that I found in Kenya, specifically in Africa. And then I started thinking about the United States and our economy lately. I'm not going to ramble on about this much longer. Bear with me. Thank you for listening this far. But inflation has been horrible. And that's not a political statement. That's math. Your money isn't worth as much as it used to be by a large margin. It's tough. But that said, the United States is still the most affluent large country on earth. And I think that as we are adjusting to this new economy here, people feel a lot of angst about, debt, how much money they're earning, how expensive it is to live. And I get all of that. So I totally understand that. But then I remember the folks in Kenya who lived in little huts made of cow manure and clay and grass, who gave generously beyond their means out of extreme need. And I think, wow, what a contrast. What a contrast. I don't really understand it. I'm not going to pretend that I do, and I'm not trying to say that it's wrong not to give or it's right to give or any of that sort of thing. I'm just being very open with you about this project. One person has donated, and I'm so thankful for it. Others, people that I personally know, have donated, and the goal remains unchanged. I think a lot of people think that someone else is giving, or maybe they just think, well, I'll get around to that, and they have good intentions, but then it hasn't happened. But I want you to know that I think the Adventure Sports Podcast family is amazing. I believe that you are the movers and the shakers in the world. We are the people that appreciate a simpler life. We're the people that appreciate connecting with nature. We're the people that appreciate adventure travel and seeing how other people around the globe live. We're the people that appreciate health and the thrill of adventure, whether it's rock climbing or motorcycle riding or bicycling all over Africa, We are the people that are more likely to connect with the reality of this world and less with the hyperbole of the media. I don't know about you, but if I think about an individual child living alone on the streets in some city in Africa who is hungry and struggling and worried about safety and where to sleep that night and even how to stay warm, I can tell you, folks, it gets cold in Africa. The equatorial regions might be in the tropics, but they have elevation. It does get cold. Anyway, all of that said, I think about that child, 5, 6, 7, 8 years old, maybe 10. I see a person that could use a leg up, someone that could use a place to sleep and a meal and some education and a chance at life rather than just being a beggar on the streets. And when I see that person, I think that's worth doing something about. And when you think about how little money it takes to change a life, just a few dollars can get that child off the streets and into a caring environment. That's what We See Hope is about. And I am all in. I've been there. I've seen the need. I love the people. And I'm all in. So that's the status. If you want to learn more about it, again, the episode that explains it all is Special Announcement, Kilimanjaro for We See Hope. And that's where we are. We are 1/1000th the way there to our $20,000 goal. And I still believe we're going to make it. People just need to know that the other person may not be taking action. We individually have to make the choice. So thank you in advance for your love, your generosity, for what you're doing, for We See Hope, making a difference in the world. And I'm not going to delay this episode anymore. Thank you for your patience as well. So here's Mason and Ron Rutland.
And as I'm talking to you, it actually reminds me, I have a lot of people coming and saying, Ron, I'm married with kids and I've got this business. I'd love to do something. What can you recommend? And honestly, I think it's for some people, it's jumping on your bike and going for a 3-day weekend. Cycle somewhere you've never cycled. Go and sleep on a hill. Just take a sleeping bag. Go sleep under a bush and a tree. Go sleep on the beach.
Hey folks, welcome to the Adventure Sports Podcast. I'm your host, Mason Gravely. You might hear it raining outside. It is absolutely pouring, so if you can hear that, my apologies. Crazy thunderstorm outside. But today, anyway, to get into today's episode, if Cycling Africa wasn't already on my list of adventures I want to do, I would have absolutely put it on here. So I'm actually going to double up and put it on again. This is ×2 something I absolutely want to do after listening to Ron's story. He's from South Africa and decided as a way to stop selling himself short and start doing something that he's proud of, something that seems out of his realm of possibility, honestly, was to bike to every single country on mainland Africa, which is 48 countries in total. And if you're familiar with how large Africa is, you know this is no small task. In fact, this was the very first time anyone had ever done this. And it took over 2 years to hit all 48 countries, cycling a total of 26,000 miles. He didn't finish with all of Africa. He actually cycled to the UK to the 2015 Rugby World Cup to watch his team, the South African national rugby team, play Japan. And unfortunately, they lost. So he biked all that way and his team lost. But he's made a habit of it. So for every World Cup, he cycles across continents to get there. Most recent one was cycling across Europe and Asia for one of the Rugby World Cups. And now he's doing it backwards. So we're going to have him back on again just to talk about what it was like to cycle across all of Europe and Asia as well. He's such a great storyteller, and it was an absolute pleasure being able to talk to him. So, no ads today, so we're just going to jump right into it. So here is the interview with Ron. Ron Rutland, welcome to the show.
Oh, Mason, this is a great thrill for me. So thank you so much. And thanks for your patience. Yeah, as you say, I love my country. I live here in South Africa. but we do have our challenges. So, and consistent power is one of them. So thank you for your patience.
Oh, no problem at all. So, we want to talk about one of your adventures. You've done other adventures, but I'd love to talk to you about one of your adventures is when you left on, the 30th of June, 2013?
Correct.
So you're coming up on an
Correct.
anniversary of that.
A good point.
Yeah, coming up. I mean, what is that? 8 years, not quite a decade, but still, it's getting there. You left Cape Town, South Africa, and is that where you live right now?
No, I actually live in KwaZulu-Natal, which is another province. So I live about 2,000 kilometers from Cape Town, but I was living there for a few years at the time.
Wow. Well, I tell you what. Before we get into going into that story, tell us about where you grew up. I usually always ask that first, and I actually forgot. But where did you grow up? Where were you born, and what kind of things did you do growing up?
Yeah, so Mason, I'm a born and bred South African. I was born just outside the city of Durban, which is the third biggest city on the east coast of the country. A beautiful tropical part of the world. And my parents are actually both born in the UK, so I'm a first generation South African, but I do feel 100% South African. It really is in my blood, and spent all my formative years in the country. And growing up, I was a very keen sports person. I played a lot of sports. And my main the sport that I excelled at the most, I guess, was rugby. I was always a bit of a bigger bloke, and it's a sport that lends itself to, there's a place for everybody, from the small, skinny, fast people to the short, fat people to the tall, fat people. It really is a sport for all. So, and as a South African, it's sort of, if you're a young South African male, it's kind of inevitable that you are going to play rugby. So I really enjoyed it. Went to a government school, a state school just outside Durban, a school called Westville. I went to the same school my whole life. And my parents never really had the desire or frankly the means to see the world. So despite them coming from the UK, I'd never been overseas growing up. We didn't do much travel. We didn't live a very adventurous life growing up, and I guess I didn't know much different though, so it wasn't that I was unhappy or anything. It's just that where my inner desires to see the world came from. I don't know. I just think it's a lot of people are born with it, and I think if you ask a lot of kids, they sort of love the idea of travel and adventure and things like that. So I was just lucky enough to have it somewhere deep in my DNA.
Well, when did you start getting into these massive adventures that you're doing now?
Oh, Mason, for me, it was a bit of a midlife crisis, I guess. I was 38 years of old when I embarked on my trip from Cape Town. So once I finished university, I went overseas for the first time to go play a little bit of rugby in Australia, and I ended up working in Hong Kong and Thailand and the UK for many years. But I ended up working in finance and banking for my sins. So really something that I wasn't suited to. And it's kind of just, I found myself falling into this career, and it seemed like a comfortable path. A lot of my friends were into it. So it sort of seemed like the well-trodden path. But deep inside me, I always had this desire to go and do a big adventure or big travels. And it was actually moving back to Cape Town, moving back to South Africa in my early 30s that's when things started to slowly change. I'd never lived in Cape Town before, but it's a fantastically beautiful city. It's got Table Mountain, which is fantastically well known. And the friends and the circle of people that I came in sort of contact with and hung out with, a lot of them were into their trail running and mountain biking. So I guess for me, it was inevitable that I got sucked into that world of endurance sport. And I say sport, for me, I love just taking part. I was never going to compete, but for me, it was, I always think of myself as a tractor versus a Ferrari. So, I'm a big guy, but I found that I could tick over for a long time. So I'd go on these long, slow rides or these long, slow hikes. It was a wonderful way to explore my new part of the world. And as the more I hung out in these kind of circles, I started meeting some people that had done some pretty big adventures in their own rights. I started meeting some adventure racers. I started meeting some people that had done some pretty big cycle trips around the country and up the east coast of Africa. And I started looking at these people, and I started realizing, you know what? The only difference between that person and that person and that person that's done all these great adventures and me is that those people have made the decision to do it. And for 38 years of my bloody life, I've looked at these people and like these people, I've gone, they must be stronger, they must be richer, they must be braver than me. And yet it was so simple. The answer was sitting right in front of me. The only difference was these people had their dreams and bloody decided to do them, and I'd always find excuses. So once I sort of started getting into the mountain biking and I started meeting these people, I had this sort of slow realization that if I put my mind to it, I could actually do something myself. So that was it. So I took out the map of Africa, and I looked at it and I thought, I'm going to cycle from Cape Town to Cairo, up the east coast of Africa. It's a relatively well documented route. People do it, I'd say relatively frequently, and in 4x4s, Land Rovers, motorbikes, bicycles even. But for me, I'd never done anything like that in my life. I probably spent 2 nights of my life in a tent. So for me, this was a big, bold, brave step, I guess. And and I sort of became obsessed with this idea. And my initial plan was to sort of take a 6-month sabbatical from my job. I thought I could negotiate that. But as I looked at this map of Africa, and as I looked at all these countries in Africa that I wasn't going to, my route became more and more zigzagged. And eventually I plotted a route from Cape Town to Cairo that was the least direct route possible. And in fact, a route that went through every single country on mainland Africa, so all 48 countries. So all of a sudden, my sort of 6-month sabbatical plan, I realized was getting thrown out the window and replaced with this dream of cycling through every country in Africa.
I mean, that's already a huge adventure to go from Cape Town to Cairo. That is a major adventure, and something that takes a lot of audacity and a lot of ambition. But you turned the dial up to 11, Ron. Like, I mean, that's unbelievable. Yeah. So let me ask you this: growing up in South Africa, playing rugby, what was being in the same continent? What was the rest of Africa viewed as where you're from, and how did you view it? Was it this scary place with lots of civil unrest and things going on, or what was it a place that was encouraged to explore?
Oh, Mason, absolutely. Yeah, I think that it's the answer is somewhere in between. I mean, I think we are lucky in South Africa that we, and at university, I had some friends who came from Zimbabwe and Malawi, some of our neighboring countries. So I did 1 or 2 shorter trips. We would sort of hitchhike up into Zimbabwe and go and visit their families, and so I got a little taste of some of our surrounding countries. And I guess I'd met, in South Africa, it's quite common for people to sort of get in sort of overland vehicles and 4x4s and go up, up to Tanzania, go up to Kenya, go up to Namibia. So certainly, the relatively sort of sub-Saharan African countries. But there is this perception, for sure, even in South Africa, that a lot of the rest of Africa, in inverted commas, is this big, scary place. And I think, so often these countries are only ever in the news when there's bad news. You'll only ever hear of Ethiopia when there's a famine outbreak, or you'll only ever hear about Algeria, when there's a bomb in Paris and somebody and the terrorist, in inverted commas, is from Algeria or has Algerian roots. And that's the only time people ever hear about these countries. But I've also heard people talk about South Africa like that, and people go, oh my goodness, isn't it such a violent country? Yet, I choose to live here, and, thousands and thousands and hundreds of thousands, millions of people choose to live in South Africa, and we have we have our frustrations, but it's a relatively safe place. And, people go trekking and hiking and adventuring all the time and have, nothing ever goes wrong, other than the normal stuff that goes wrong in the wilderness. There was a sort of, I guess I was relatively pragmatic about it. And I traveled enough, I guess, even in other parts of the world to realize that often your preconceived idea of a country is so different to the reality on the ground. So I guess for me, it was, I had a lot of people asking me, Ron, are you sure you want to do this? Are you sure you're going to be safe? And of course, there were concerns, but you can't sort of paint the whole continent, with one brushstroke.
You shouldn't, but plenty of people do.
Oh no, of course, 100. Yeah, they do. And but I sort of drilled down and I looked at each individual country, and I sort of did as much research on the particular countries and what was going on. And there were certain parts of some countries that I specifically avoided in my planning. And obviously, you keep your ear close to the ground as you go. But sure, I think once I got going, and once I was on the road for a couple of months, and everywhere I went, over and over again, I was just, welcomed like the strange white guy on a bicycle in the middle of rural Mozambique, or the strange white guy on the bicycle in the middle of rural Angola. And yet the people, there was no like, look at him, he's a walking, money machine, let's hit him over the head and take him for everything he's got. It was more like, wow, here's this, obviously the language barrier was a big thing, but people would see me and the first thing that they would do is offer me food and water.
Wow.
And yet that's their most valuable resource, and you haven't seen a river or a pump or a well for days. And yet the first thing you get into a village is people offer you water and are not looking for anything in return. And so once you've been, once you've experienced that for the first few weeks and months, you kind of, it does change your perspective, and you start like assuming the best in people. And honestly, 99.9% of the time, that's exactly right. And you're rewarded for that assumption.
This is such an enormous adventure. I honestly don't even know where to start. It's a little mind blowing. But take us through. I tell you what. Let's start here. Take us through. What did it feel like to? Because I'm looking at your map and the way you went, and you're going through South Africa. And once you start to get towards the border, what was going through your mind? What were you feeling? Did you feel comfortable in what you had set out to do, or was it still this thing that said, I don't know what the road ahead is going to hold, and that terrifies me?
Mason, I think one of the key things for me is that when I left on this trip, I went through a very deliberate process of, people talk about burning the bridges or burning the boats, and I literally sold everything in the world that I owned to make this trip happen. And when I say everything, I didn't own an apartment or anything. I was renting an apartment, but I sold my car. I sold every belonging. I went on to, our equivalent of Craigslist and just sold everything. And that was partly to help finance the trip. But also for me, it was like, I think in the back of my mind, if I'd left a whole lot of stuff at a mate's apartment in Cape Town or in his garage, it would have almost, for me, been like, I'm hedging my bets. Let me go and try this trip. Let me go and see how far I get. But you know what? If something goes wrong, or if I don't like it, I can always go back to Cape Town and pick up where I left off. But in my mind, this trip was going to take me well over 2.5 years or well over 2 years. And I said, if I'm going to be serious about finishing this trip and getting to Cairo and ultimately getting to the UK afterwards, what is the point of leaving a whole lot of stuff in my mate's garage? So it's weird, like having never done anything like this in my life before. I mean, the bicycle that I bought, I'd never ridden that bike until the day that I started this trip, and was fully loaded with all the panniers, 35 kilograms of all my gear, and I actually broke my wrist a few months before I left, so I had done no exercise, and I'm that sort of person that as soon as I stop exercising, I start getting fat, and also like I was living on a mate's couch for the last, on his couch for the last few months before I left, so I was eating badly, so it really was like the fattest and unfittest of my life when I started the trip. But deep inside of me, I was all in. Like I'd quit my job, I'd sold everything, and in my heart, like I committed everything to this journey. Like I said, I've dreamt of doing something like this my whole life. And for the first 38 years of my life, I doubted myself. For the first 38 years of my life, I actually, I realized like how I'd sold myself short in different areas of my life before. And I just said, Ron, this is the first time in your life you're doing something truly out of your comfort zone. It's the first time in your life you sort of, you're really just living true to yourself, like deep inside of my heart. Like this is what I wanted to be doing. And I said to myself, unless I literally get squashed by a truck in some corner of Africa, I am going to find a way to finish this journey. So it's weird. Like it's I just had this quiet confidence that, things would work out, and that just because I had this sort of single focus and single purpose, I would get there. But it does come with a big but, But day one, I was in terrible shape, and it was the only day of the trip that I actually planned in terms of a start point and end point, because I had some friends came to see me off. And this is, after 6 or 7 months of planning, a lot of people telling me, almost joking, some joking, some not joking, going, Ron, let's see how quickly it is before you're back here. Let's see how quickly it is before your bike's stolen. Let's see, hopefully you survive malaria. So people sort of like saying, good luck, Ron, well done. Good luck, well done for taking the plunge, but almost like betting how long it would, you would actually last, But at the same time, they all came out to support me, to see me off. So I think they wanted me to succeed, but there was this sort of undercurrents of like, God, I hope he's going to be all right kind of thing. But, and as you say, like a little bit of like, oof, he doesn't look so prepared, maybe this is not such a good idea. But, anyway, I got through that day one, and it was 80 kilometers, which, now that I look at it, should have been so easy, but fully loaded touring bike, totally unfit. I'd never ridden that bike, and it was a long, long day out, and I was even cramping towards the end. And, a lot of the wives and girlfriends and boyfriends of people that were riding, but, that went to, they went to the town that we were cycling to, and, we had arranged this big barbecue at lunchtime, and we arrived like 3 hours late because of me. But you know what? It was amazing. I finished day one, and then the next morning I woke up, everybody had left, and I stayed at my friend's house, and I got on my bike, and I rode like 30 or 40 kilometers that second day. My legs were sore, my rear end was sore, but the adventure had started. And then day three I rode, and I did a bit further, and day 4 I went a bit further, and somebody would put me up at, a farmer would put me up, at his house, and then he would tell his friends 100 kilometers down the road, and they would put me up at their house the next night and give me a good meal. So, that first few weeks cycling in South Africa on my way to Lesotho, which was the first country outside of South Africa, I think it was a little bit of a honeymoon period. Your telephone still works. You still understand the money. You can always, with your Google Maps, you can tell where the next town is. So there's a sort of comfort of still being in your home ground advantage, I guess. And that sort of, over those first few weeks, my legs started getting used to life, you're getting used to riding 5 or 6 hours a day. So by the time I got to Lesotho, it was 3 or 4 weeks into the trip, and it was exciting. The first time I ever crossed the border on a bicycle, and I stamp, and I remember the thrill of, getting my stamp, leaving South Africa, getting into Lesotho. And I was only in Lesotho for a few days before I popped out the other end. It's landlocked by South Africa, so back into South Africa, then into Swaziland, then back into South Africa, and then going into Mozambique. I must admit, that's when, I was probably 6 weeks into the journey. I'd crossed South Africa, I'd crossed these other 2 small countries, and now I was leaving South Africa for the third and final time. And it was a sense of like, wow, I'm now going into the rest of Africa, and I wonder what lies ahead. So there was a little bit of like, butterflies, but also, to be honest, a bit of excitement at the same time.
I just can't even imagine, if you want me to be honest, just how much how big this felt. It's amazing to me. People don't realize just how large Africa is. And I know I don't understand just how big it is and how diverse it is and varied it is. What was the biggest transition for you in the sense of maybe the land or the terrain or the climate or the culture? What was the biggest I am not at home anymore situation?
Wow. So I think for me, there's 2. I'm going to give you 2 examples. The first was relatively closer to home. So the 5th or 6th country I went into was Angola. So Angola is the first country on this journey that I hadn't been to before. It's also the first country as a South African that we actually need a visa for. So we have a visa-free arrangement for our neighboring countries. And it's also the first country on the trip where people that had been there had told me how rubbish it was. I know your previous president had quite a description of the countries in Africa. But one of my, mates of mine would say the same thing. They go, Ron, Angola is a S-hole country, and they've done business there and they've traveled there. And I think there's something about a bicycle, and this is what I did learn. There's something about a bicycle that makes you relatable. There's something about a bicycle that makes you're making yourself completely vulnerable. And it just creates this connection with people. So, I was on the border with Angola. I'd been on the road now probably 4 months. And I had some crazy wild experiences in those, in Zimbabwe, in Mozambique, in Zambia, in Namibia. I had some wild, crazy experiences. But as I said to you before, like the same, I had this, but everywhere I'd gone, people had been wonderful to me and welcoming. But there was still the sense of trepidation when I crossed into Angola. I managed to get the visa. People told me it would be very difficult, and it wasn't easy, but I got it, in the end, relatively easily. People told me it was corrupt. I crossed the border, not an any issue at all. But it was a very remote and wild part of Angola. There's absolutely no English whatsoever. And it was the first time on the trip where I realized that, to some people on this, I was going to explore Africa. I was going to go and look at the different cultures. I was going to go and, experience this, as you said, the diversity of the continent. But it was the first time that I actually felt like I was giving people an experience of that as well. Like, it is such a remote part of Angola that I can imagine they've seen very few white people, and they've definitely seen very few white people on a bicycle. And it was the first time that I saw kids that were almost too scared to come and speak to me. Like, they'd almost hide behind their parents' legs and almost like dare each other to come and touch me or to come and speak to me. So it was like, I felt like a little bit of a freak in a circus show, but so for me, that was maybe, I wouldn't say uncomfortable, but it was just like, wow, like I really am in a part of the continent where, I stand out. And as I said, I was never made to feel unwelcome. I was never made to feel uncomfortable, but it was quite a bizarre situation when you realize that I'm in my own continent. I'm actually not that far from South Africa, but here there are people that are looking at me and, with utter bewilderment. So that really, sticks with me, that experience in Angola. And I'm actually going to come back to Angola now. I'm going to talk about one of my favorite stories of the trip, if you don't mind.
Please do.
Yeah, but I'm going to jump ahead to Ethiopia. So Ethiopia was, up northeast of Africa. And that was, for me, was such a dramatic change. So I was in northern Kenya, which is in itself wild and remote. But I crossed into Ethiopia on what happened to be the 31st of December, 2013. And obviously, coming from where most of the world, that's a significant date. And I crossed the border and I got to this border town, which was about 16 kilometers inside of Ethiopia. And I thought, what an amazing, I'm here in the middle of Africa, the southern tip of Ethiopia on New Year's Eve. Let me go and try and find a restaurant or a bar and enjoy a couple of beers. It wasn't exactly a heaving town, but, I found this restaurant, straw on the floor, no walls, very, very basic. And I thought there would be some people out and about, and I had one or two beers, but no one was like out celebrating. There's nothing really going on. And I thought, I thought this was a little bit strange. And the restaurant owner let me sleep on the floor of his restaurant. And I woke up the next morning and I carried on. And it was only when I got to the first major city relative term city in Ethiopia, that someone actually explained to me that Ethiopia we use the Gregorian calendar, most of the world, but they actually use a different calendar, and I can't remember the name of it. But so for us, it was the 31st of December, but in Ethiopia, it was like the 14th of February or something. So their calendar is like 6 weeks off ours. They tell time differently. Like we use midnight as the basis of our time. So if I say, I'll see you 8 o'clock tomorrow morning, I'll see you 8 tomorrow morning, it's 8 hours after midnight. There, if they say, I'll see you at 8 tomorrow, it's actually 2 in the afternoon, because they for them, 6 a.m., their equivalent of 6 a.m., or our equivalent of 6 a.m. is effectively their hour naught. And the people look different. The food is fantastic. So it really was a very, very distinct difference between the sub-Saharan Africa that I was brought up in, and our neighboring countries, and Ethiopia, which was, and it's the only country in Africa never to be colonized. So it's a very unique part of the world.
Let's take a quick message break and hear from the folks that help make this show possible.
Hey friends, here at the Adventure Sports Podcast, health is really a priority. That's part of the reason why for over 10 years we've been encouraging people to get out there and have some fun, because when we become more active, it makes us healthier. Our focus on health is one of the reasons that I'm excited about today's sponsor, True Diagnostic. Did you know that your calendar age doesn't always match how old your body truly is? Your biological age, the age of your cells and organs, is actually the number one predictor of your risk for serious diseases like heart disease, cancer, dementia, and more. That's why learning your biological age can be truly life-changing, and that's exactly what the True Age test from True Diagnostic helps you do. It's a simple at-home test. You just prick your finger and then use the provided packaging and a prepaid envelope to send the sample in for testing. No doctor's visits required, no labs, but you'll get great information that can help you to be healthier and understand how you're doing with your own health habits. Now, I always joke that I'm 23 years old. You've heard me say that forever. Obviously, I'm quite a bit older than that, but I'm curious to find out what my biological age is. It's kind of eye-opening when you learn that your biological age, if it's just 5 years older than your actual age, your risk for major diseases can go up by 30 to 50%. That's kind of a wake-up call. But due to epigenetics, and this is the part that really inspires me, up to 90% of biological aging is driven by lifestyle. That means the way that we eat, move, sleep, manage stress, all these things play massive roles in how fast or slow our bodies age. That aligns with the Adventure Sports Podcast so much. So I'm taking the test. I'm excited to find out the results. And in addition to my biological age, True Diagnostic also provides a personalized report that's full of science-backed steps that we can all take to slow down aging and improve our health over time. If you care about protecting your health and want to find out what your real age is, head over to truediagnostic.com and use my code ASP to get 20% off your entire order or subscription. That's truediagnostic.com. Use ASP at checkout to get 20% off. Your future self will thank you. It's crazy how easy it is to put off shopping for the holidays. I'm guilty because shopping's not really my thing. That's why I'm glad that our sponsor today, Uncommon Goods, takes the stress out of gifting with thousands of unique, high-quality finds that you won't see anywhere else. So I was just on their website. There's an SUV table that sits on the tire and props out and then against the tire, so it makes an instant table wherever you are, camping or maybe just stopping to sit and enjoy the view. Instant table, pretty cool. I'd never seen anything like that before. Uncommon Goods has something for everyone. It's not just about four-wheel drive enthusiasts, obviously. They have categories for moms and dads and kids and teens, book lovers, history buffs, football fans, foodies, mixologists, avid gardeners. You'll find thousands of new gift ideas that you won't find anywhere else. That's going to help me this year. Now, Uncommon Goods supports artists and small independent businesses. They offer many handcrafted products. They're made in small batches. And with every purchase, I love this, they give back $1 to a nonprofit partner of your choice, which means they have actually donated more than $3.1 million to date. So don't wait. Cross those names off your list before the rush. To get 15% off your next gift, go to uncommongoods.com/ASP. That's uncommongoods.com/ASP for 15% off. Uncommon Goods. We're all out of the ordinary.
That is plenty of that for now. Let's get back into the episode. Wow.
Yeah,
I can't imagine the differences and just how, the level of stories that you have. Is there something on the trip that sticks out to you as something unexpected that happened, whether that be with the weather or with the terrain, like I said, or culture or people? Like, was anything that just caught you off guard?
Yeah, so I think I'm going to refer to Ethiopia again, and specifically, as I say, that initial culture shock, which really was, other countries there were nuances and slightly different food and different languages, but this really, Ethiopia really was this distinctive difference. But what really blew me away was the Simeon Mountains in northern Ethiopia. I'd read a lot about, as much as I could, about the different countries I was cycling through, but to research 48 countries in deep detail is difficult. There's only so much you can do. But I was cycling in northern Ethiopia, and the Simeon Mountains have got to be some of the most dramatically beautiful and remote and wild mountains I've ever seen in my life. I grew up in South Africa, always thinking of Ethiopia as a country, just a desert, basically. And, I don't know how old you are, Mason, but, in the early 80s, the mid 80s, there was Live Aid, and there was all these, there was this big famine in East Africa. And, anytime that part of the world was ever in the news was, these kids with big tummies and flies around. And so that's just sort of, I guess, in the back of my mind, some of what I kind of not really expected, but sort of what was burnt in my memory. And yet here I was in these mountains in northern Ethiopia that wouldn't have looked out of place, and maybe not the Himalayas, but certainly in the Alps or maybe even the Rocky Mountains or something. But it was just dramatically beautiful. Yeah, wild, wild, wild.
That is, I'm looking at pictures right now, and that is, I've never seen those before. Wow.
Yeah, it's so crazy. And then I think more from a people and culture point of view, if you've got a map in front of you, so the Republic of Congo, which is the smaller of the two Congos, I actually came in from the north, from Cameroon, Central African Republic, into the northern Congo. And that has got to be some of the most remote, wildest, rainforests in Africa. And there it was mind blowing. It's some of the hardest riding I've done in my life. It's, being on the tropics, it's around the equator, it's always wet and muddy. The infrastructure really isn't very good at all. But you come across these villages, and there's obviously that's where the pygmies of Africa, that's where they're from. And you end up camping with these pygmies, and it's just like, I cannot believe this is happening to me. These are like people and cultures that I've only ever read about in National Geographic magazines or seen on the Discovery Channel. And here I am, like this complete novice adventurer. I'm cycling in the northern Congo jungles, and I'm stumbling across like the pygmies. And I just went, this is just like, that was a pinch me, one of those pinch yourself moments. And it's just, Africa has, and I stand to be corrected, but something like 2,500 languages, and some of them are only spoken by, unfortunately, a lot of them are dying very quickly. And, there's only a few, tribes, and maybe in some cases, one tribe speaks one language. They're the only people that speak these languages. So, I mean, the diversity of Africa is just enormous, and it's just, it's quite sad. I think that often people just think, you're from Africa, and they sort of have in mind what you look like or what you're going to be like. But my goodness, it's a diverse continent.
What would you say one of the biggest lessons you've learned from that experience, and maybe a story that goes along with teaching you that lesson?
So I think for me, it's one of the key lessons is, and I alluded to it earlier, is to assume the best in people. And I'm going to give you an example, and this is what I actually want to talk about with Angola. So going back to Angola being the first time, the first country on the trip I hadn't been to, the first country that people had really warned me about. And it was. I got into Angola, and it was remote and it was wild, but it was exciting. And I was like, I spent a lot of time, cycling along the Zambezi River, and it's beautiful. It's exactly what you dream about when you cycle through. You think of cycling through Africa, but there was no villages, no villages of significance. Nowhere to, getting supplies was very difficult. And after about a week on the road in Angola, I got to this small town, which as it turns out was the only town that I got to at all in Angola, and it's right there in the eastern bit that sort of sticks into Zambia. And I got to this town, and I was pushing my bike down this, I guess, the high street, it's just a dirt road. And I was looking for a store to get some supplies. And then all of a sudden, this policeman comes out from a guard hut on the side of the road. And he's a bit scruffily dressed, and he comes over to me, and he starts talking to me in Portuguese, and sort of, and he starts, gesticulating and sort of get quite excited. And then I'm looking at him like quizzically. I have no idea what he's saying, And then he sort of rubs his thumb and forefinger together. And I thought, I know what that means. That's the international sign language that he's looking for a little bit of a toll fee to let me pass. And people will warn me about, sort of this kind of low level corruption, if you want, in Africa. And I'd made up my mind that if I ever encountered anything like this, I was not going to even enter negotiations. I think often people will prey on your impatience. So I went through my routine of like patting my pockets and going, no money, sorry, no money. And he looks at me again, and he's like, and you can see he's not quite computing. So he goes through the process again, and he rubs his thumb and forefinger together. And I go, this cheeky guy. So I went, no money. And then we go through the third time, but the third time he does it, actually puts his hand into his pocket, and he pulls out a few crumpled notes, and he actually pushes them towards me. And I thought, cheeky bugger, he's now like, showing me exactly what he wants. So I actually I wasn't aggressive, but I sort of, pushed his hand gently, and I said, no money. And then he looks, and again, he looks at me, and he sort of shakes his head, and he then sort of simulates the, drinking out of a bottle. And he goes, no, Coca. And I suddenly realized that this policeman, who probably earns $30 a month, $40 a month, I have no idea, but it won't be much more than that. But he was actually offering me money to buy a Coke. So he was going, Coca. You want money? You want Coca? And I promise you, Mason, I have never been more mortified in my life. That I'd allowed my preconceived ideas of what a policeman in Angola would be wanting from me. And yet all he was doing was actually saying, you want money? You need money. So I could go and buy a Coke. And I honestly and all of a sudden, I said, no, don't worry. After pleading poverty, all of a sudden, no worries. I've got money. And he wouldn't accept, he insisted on buying me a Coke. And I've never in my life been more, I was embarrassed doesn't even begin to sum it up. Like, I had been on the road for 3 months. I'd experienced so much of the goodness of people over and over and over again. I mean, sub-Saharan Africa is the poorest, depending how you judge wealth anyway. But if you look at the IMF or these fancy economists, sub-Saharan Africa is technically the poorest place in the world. And over again, I'd come to villages in the middle of nowhere, people that don't have running water, there's no stores to buy food, yet the first thing people would do would be offer you food and water, their most valuable resource, And I'd been on the receiving end of all this goodness and all this positivity for 3 months, and yet deep in my mind, I allowed the sort of the warnings that I had before this trip, like people are corrupt, people are going to want money from you in Angola, and it was directly the opposite. And I actually made a point. I said to myself, Ron, from this moment on, you are going to assume the best in people for the rest of this trip. And honestly, Mason, I can count on one hand, in 800 and something days in the road, the number of times that I had issues with people. And I was never robbed. Nobody ever hit me over the head. So it was nothing major. But from that for me is a moment, and didn't just change my attitude for the rest of that trip, but I do try and remind myself now. I've obviously done other trips subsequently, and back in my normal life here in South Africa, I do try and remind myself when I find myself slipping into, allowing myself to sort of get a bit negative about things. That lesson for me of assuming the best in people it pays dividends over and over and over again.
Ron, that's a beautiful story. You being on the road in one of the most probably challenging places to do something like this, all of Africa, in the world, that is, like one of the most probably apprehensive places people would adventure on ground level like this.
Yeah.
And to hear that the biggest lesson you learned, or one of the biggest lessons you've learned, is to assume the good in people is just, it just blows my mind that if you can do it there and you can assume it there, in your situation, we can at any time of our lives, anywhere we are.
And any interaction, exactly. And it's the same, like, the complete opposite, if when you're in London or Hong Kong or New York or Chicago or, big cities and busy places, like all the most remote corners of the world, I really do, honestly, without trying to sound like kumbaya, like honestly, it's, I've subsequently, I trekked across Mongolia, I've cycled across Europe and Asia, I've done adventures in over 100 countries in the world, from the most poorest countries in Sub-Saharan Africa, Central Asia, to Western Europe, and honestly, that it's a truism that I absolutely stand by.
That is so fantastic. This has kind of taken us out of the experience itself and out of some of the other trips you've done, which are 100% qualified to be their own podcast episodes. We'll have to have you back on and talk about them. And I'll have to plan some more time because I want to hear some of this more in depth. For you said the first 38 years of your life, you felt like you were making decisions on fear and weren't really, doing things like this, of course. Or how would you have done this if you had not had the ability to do this experience? How would you have taken your life into your own hands and into your control? Maybe if you didn't have the ability to take 2 years off, what could you foresee now to learn those same lessons? What could you do?
Well, Mason, I've never been asked it like that. It's quite a hypothetical because, I think for me, and I'm sort of thinking on the fly here, but I look back at the first 38 years of my life and I realize how much I sold myself short, like in everything I did, whether it was my rugby career, like, I was never going to play for South Africa. I was never going to be a full-time professional rugby player. But I think that I always, as much as I think that I tried as hard as I could, as much as I enjoyed the sport as much as I could, I do think that deep inside of me, I never truly had the belief that I was, as good as the people around me, and I just sort of, for some reason, had this sort of, this self-doubt about how good I could be. And then when I think of myself in my working life, in my careers, various different sort of jobs and careers I've had, I also look back now and I go like, I would look at people around me and I'd go, oh, they're so much better than me, or, they're so much smoother than me. They're much better salespeople than me. I can never be like that. And it's such a self-defeating attitude. And I think for me, it was like, it was a combination of like frustration at feeling that I sort of wasn't living the life true to myself. There was this frustration that, I saw people around me succeeding in what they did more than me. I looked at people and then it was when it came to adventure, started looking at some of these people that had done these big adventures. And I think for me, it was, I dreamt of the hardest thing I could possibly do on a bicycle. And I think, although I wasn't consciously thinking it, I think deep down inside of me, I said, if I can make this happen, then truly anything is possible. Like, nobody's ever attempted a single journey through every country in Africa in anything. Nobody tried it on a motorbike. Nobody done it on a 4x4. And here I was planning it on a bicycle. And it is this, again, it is, despite everything I was telling you earlier, there is a lot of, there are a lot of people, plant seeds of doubt in your mind. And, next thing you're planning a trip and you'll catch a news bulletin about something going on. And, but yeah, so I think it was like, for me, it was a subconscious decision to do the hardest thing I possibly could, knowing that if I did it, it would almost like just kickstart my life. And that's exactly what happened. Like when I finished this journey, like I had no money. I'd maxed out every credit card. I'd borrowed money from friends and people. to get to the end of the journey. But I'd done it. I dreamt of the hardest thing and I'd pulled it off. And it was the confidence boost that it's given me in every area of my life since. It's just been transformational. So, it's hard to say what could I have done differently or what could I have not done in 2 years. But, I have a lot of people, and as I'm talking to you, it actually reminds me, I have a lot of people coming and saying, Ron, I'm married with kids and I've got this business and I'd love to do something like this. I'd love to do something. What can you recommend? And honestly, I think it's for some people, it's jumping on your bike and going for a 3-day weekend, cycle somewhere you've never cycled, go and sleep on a hill, just take a sleeping bag, go sleep under a bush and a tree, go sleep on the beach. You live in your comfortable house with your air conditioning and, you've got your nice fancy car and you drive to a holiday cottage, you spend 2 days on the beach surfing and, drinking, you pack up, you get back in your car and you go home and that's a fun weekend. But do something but for a lot of people like that, the thought of sleeping on the beach or the thought of sleeping on a hill is like, oh my goodness, aren't you going to get mugged? What happens if it rains? So there are all these reasons why you can't do those things. So I almost suggest just go and do something crazy. Go and do something what you consider crazy. If it's a 3-day weekend or even a 2-day weekend, leave work on a Friday, put a sleeping bag, in a backpack, a couple of sandwiches and a bottle of water and go cycle and find somewhere to sleep for the night and then cycle back the next day. So I don't know, probably not answering your question, but that's just some of the sort of recollections and just what I did, I guess, to overcome my own fears and self-doubts.
What do you do now to continue that mindset? Do you take your own advice? Do you sleep, in random places or on a hillside? How do you keep that adventure movement going in you?
Yeah, so I mean, for sure, like I don't. I did that African trip and I was on the road for 27 months and, and it was now that it all it did was it put fuel into the fire for me. So, I'm not someone who's going to go and spend 10 years on the road and I do like coming home. I do like seeing my friends and family. I do like the comforts of, a normal life in inverted commas for a bit, but I came back after that trip having, as I said to you, no money, nothing. But it was all of a sudden like, well, if I can find a way of getting through Africa, if I can get over all these challenges that I've got through on this journey of cycling through Africa, to find a job or to find, some way to put food on the table, surely I can do that. And as it turns out, when I got back from my trip, everybody wanted to hear about my story. So, so I'd find myself at friends' houses or at barbecues or in a bar, and I'd be spending hours and hours telling stories about my trip. And then someone said to me,
man, I can't even imagine just trying to, get home and tell people how, because they'd probably say, hey, how was your trip? And leave it at that.
Yeah. But then some people said, oh, Ron, and actually, I'll tell you, one of my friends, his company were having a golf day for some of their clients. And they had I think they had a comedian booked to come in. So they're playing golf and they were going to, have a big fancy dinner. And I think they brought in they were going to have a comedian. And the comedian, canceled on like sort of 2 days before. So this guy phones me in a panic and he says, Ron, basically, do you want to replace the comedian and just come and stand on stage and tell some stories about your bicycle trip? So I just did it as a favor, I stood on, I had some of my photographs and a projector and I just told some stories about my trip and people were fascinated. And then somebody in the audience said, oh, Ron, we've got a sales conference next month. Don't you want to come into a motivational talk? And, at this stage, I didn't even realize there was an option. And I guess that led me, but, like for a lot of people, when you go and stand on stage for the first time, to do a speech or a talk, some people freeze up and people find it very, very difficult. And that for me I still remember like that, this like real sick feeling with, I was going to be on the stage. I was going to be the center of attention. Despite, and I almost felt self-conscious as I was talking about my trip. Yeah, but now, so that was sort of, a bit of, that sort of overcoming the sort of public speaking thing. But then you do it a couple of times, you become comfortable and you realize people enjoy it. So I really enjoy it. I've told my story to probably, I don't want to exaggerate, but I'd say 100 schools in South Africa and companies. And so that kind of sort of helped get me back on my feet. Yeah, I reconnected with another friend, and after a year or so of doing that, I started thinking about what next. It was time for another adventure, and it's amazing how life works, but I know we're running out of time, but I reconnected with an old friend of mine from Hong Kong, and he was a keen golfer, and I did a talk to him and his rugby team, and he said, Ron, I've got no interest in cycling through Africa, but I'd love to do something with golf. The next thing, over 2 hours of drinking coffee together, we came up with an idea of him and I playing golf across Mongolia. So that confidence that I'd had to look at a map and go, well, this is what you need to, if you can plan a trip cycling through Africa, you can plan anything. So you go, okay, well, perfect. We'll get a set of golf clubs. I'll have a cart. I'll pull our stuff. You can walk and hit this thing. And you just realize that you can just draw a black line on a map and make anything happen. And that's for me has been the most liberating thing. So I just basically lived from pulling out a map, drawing a line of something that I'd love to do, and then just putting everything in place to make that happen. And it's a pretty cool way to be living my life.
Let's take a quick message break and hear from the folks that help make this show possible. That is plenty of that for now. Let's get back into the episode. I'd say, what an incredible experience. I definitely want to have you back on, but I think we have time for a few more questions about this trip specifically. Perfect. Yeah, I hate to jump all the way back, but man, tell me about, was there a moment or an experience where you maybe had a self-reflection and thought, how did I end up in this situation? Like a very random situation or something where you thought, plan this trip, do this thing. I never thought in a million years I would be right here.
Yeah, I'll tell you straight away. Lake Assal. So ASSAL.
All right, I'm looking it up right now. ASSAL.
It's in Djibouti, which is a tiny little country on the Horn of Africa. Most people would go, Djibouti, is that a country? And go, yep. So it's so it's between Somalia, Ethiopia, Eritrea. So it's right on the Horn of Africa, the entrance to the Red Sea. Anyway, Lake Assal is the third lowest place on the planet and the lowest point in Africa. So it's 150 meters below sea level. So you're cycling in the middle of the desert, and they're in the middle of, well, not the middle of the Horn of Africa, and you come across these series of lakes which are below sea level, and they're completely saline. So it's like, I think it's the Dead Sea and the Sea of Galilee. You see those famous photographs of people lying in the sea reading their newspapers because it's so salty. And that's exactly what this is. And there you are in the middle of the desert, in the middle of Africa. You've got the third lowest point in the world, and it's this ancient, it's obviously, from when the continent split up, it's actually a part of what would have been the ocean, the original ocean. And here it is in the middle of the desert. It's this, you have like this white crust that, of the shore basically, which runs for like 100 yards from the sand to the actual where the water starts. And you walk through and it crunches. And it's just, you pick it up and you taste it, and it's just, it's obviously salty. And you get to this water, and it's so salty, it's almost itchy. And there you are, you can lie on this lake in the middle of the African desert. And I just went like, this is just ridiculous. Like, I had no idea this place even existed. It was only in my research, like planning this trip, that I really identified Djibouti and where it was and have any idea. And here I am. So for me, that was one of those moments, was just like, this is ridiculous. I mean, I've never even seen this on National Geographic. And here I am experiencing it for myself.
I'm sure there were thousands of places like that where they were off. They weren't on the list of top destinations, but you discover them by accident maybe, and it became probably some of your favorite experiences of the whole thing.
Yeah. 100%. And there's another one jumps to mind, and you look at, I always, so one of the biggest challenges on a trip like this is your visas. How do you organize visas while you're on the road? And there's very few disadvantages on a bicycle, but one of them is that it's very, if the nearest city, is 400 kilometers off route where you can go to, you want to go and get a visa application for the next country, that's an 800K detour, which is like a 10-day detour at minimum, So I was doing this, it's a long, I could spend for hours just explaining how I organize visas, but I got to, and it was all going quite smoothly actually, until I got to Gabon, which is on the west coast of Africa, just near the Congo there, pretty much on the equator. And I was in Libreville, which is the capital, waiting for my visa for Equatorial Guinea, which is one of these very tiny postage stamp countries that is, it's a result of, history basically. It's a very bizarre little country, but it's a notoriously difficult and bureaucratic process to get your visa for. So I actually ended up being stuck in Libreville for almost a month. So it was the biggest delay in my trip, or the biggest holdup of the trip, of the whole thing. But while I was there, you might notice if you look at a map, just off the coast to the west, there's two little islands called, it's actually the country of Sao Tome and Principe.
Yeah, I'm looking at it.
Yeah, and it's the most, again, I'll be completely honest, I had no idea this country existed before I did this trip. And, in my research, so Africa has 54 countries, 48 on mainland, and there's 6 island nations. So there's 4 in the Indian Ocean on the east, and there's 2 on the west, which is the Cape Verde Islands, and then there's this little country of Sao Tome and Principe. So when I was in Libreville, I was updating my blog, and I was stuck there. And my one friend replied and said, "Ron, if you're in Libreville, you should go to Sao Tome because." And it's a long story, but he had a friend who actually invested in some in a conservation project there. So they very generously sponsored me a flight from Libreville to Sao Tome. It's only a little hour flight, but you have the country is made up of 2 islands which straddle the equator. And I promise you, when you fly into it looks like Jurassic Park. So it's this completely rainforest covered little island / country. All the mist, kind of in the valleys, and it's just like Jurassic Park without the fences. That's the first impression that I had.
Wow.
And it's just so I ended up spending like 10 days in Sao Tome and Principe, sort of just kicking back. I obviously left my bicycle in Libreville. I actually rented a motorbike for a couple of days to go and explore the bigger of the 2 islands. But it was just the most magical place. And the smaller island of the 2, I actually hiked the whole island over a day with a local guide. You come across these old plantation homes that have been completely overgrown. So it used to be a Portuguese colony, and then they used to grow, I want to say coffee. I think it was coffee. The Portuguese handed the country back, at the end of the colonial in the 1970s. The Portuguese basically fled and left the country to, left the new government or, people to look after themselves. So all these sort of big fancy plantations became overgrown because there was no expertise knew how to run them. So the whole island, it's amazing what nature does when it recovers. So so they basically have these big homes, and obviously they've all collapsed and ruined, but in the middle of the jungle, and there's the old railway line, which is completely covered in jungle. Yeah, just this bizarre little place, but just a fantastic, bewildering, crazy, just magical little spot in the middle of the Atlantic.
Wow. I've never even, I've seen it on a map. I don't know anything about it. Don't hear anything about it. So it's just amazing what's out there that isn't talked about that much, that you are able to discover when you get out there and see it, that you'll never know otherwise.
100%.
Where can people find you? Where can people see what you're doing next? And do you have any plans for something coming up?
Well, the answer is yes, yes, and yes. So,
all right.
So this trip took me from Cape Town, and although it was primarily about Africa, I actually pushed on through and I cycled through Europe and got to the UK. I'm a big rugby fan, and the Rugby World Cup was taking place in the UK in 2015. So fast forward 4 years later, I actually cycled with a friend of mine with a very different type of journey. We actually had a sponsor this time, and we were doing some proper fundraising. So in 2019, my mate James and I cycled from London to Tokyo because the Rugby World Cup in 2019 was taking place in Japan. So I kind of had this theme of cycling to World Cups. So I'm now planning the next one, which will be cycling from Tokyo to Paris, starting in January is the goal. And it's actually going to be 20 months. And cycling, basically, it's a bit of a convoluted route, but I'm basically going to cycle from Japan back through China, Vietnam, south through Thailand, Malaysia, Indonesia, across Australia, up New Zealand. Then I'm going to catch a flight to the Ushuaia in the bottom of Argentina, and cycle up the whole of South America, the whole of Central America. And then I'm going to come and visit you, Mason, because from Mexico, I'm going to enter Texas and then head all the way up, the south and then the east up to New York, Boston, into southeast Canada, and then fly across to Iceland and then onto the UK and onto Paris. So that's going to be a 40,000 kilometer journey through 41 countries starting in January. So that's my next big adventure. And if you go to ronrutland.com, I'm actually just in the process of redoing the site. So ronrutland.com, my name. There'll be links to history, the stories of all my journeys. I've actually done a documentary on our cycle trip from London to Tokyo. There's a documentary there on my Mongolian golfing adventure, and a gallery with hundreds of photographs from my African trip. So, but it's work in progress. But the next week or so, it'll be up and running properly. And if you just search for Ron Rutland on Twitter and Instagram, and you'll see all the links there.
How exciting, Ron. That is a heck of an adventure. Please, I know it's going to be a while, but please stay in touch. I'd love to host you. I'd love to interview you in person too. And before you leave, we got to get an interview to hear about that Tokyo to where was it? Tokyo to
London to Tokyo.
London to Tokyo. Holy cow. I want to hear about that, because that seems even, more distinct changes culturally and environmentally. That is wild. All right, Ron, I'll talk to you soon, man.
All right, mate. Thank you so much. Cheers, Mason. Great chatting.
First of all, thank you so much for listening. It means the world to us that you choose to listen to the show. If you'd like to help us further, you can leave a review on iTunes, share us with your friends, your family. It goes a long way to grow in the show. You can also support us financially through patreon.com/adventuresportspodcast. Link is in the show notes. And also, if you have an idea of who could be a good guest for the show, we're always looking for people to tell their story about the outdoors or adventure. So if you know someone, please reach out. Email us at info@adventuresportspodcast.com. And until then, get out there and have some fun.